Is the sound all good? Perfect. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. 4 of you, maybe 1 or 2 might join. Firstly, just to check in, are you all good so far with preparing for your assignment? Are there any questions on the assignment, or have we covered it? Great. All good. Thank you. That's good to hear. Hopefully that the national support session was useful for you. So this evening's collab, well done, almost ready to submit. That's great. Submit earlier rather than later is a good approach. So this evening's collab, we're going to move on to learning unit 4, which is on the perceiving mind around sensation and perception. It's not a very difficult unit and it's not a very long unit. So hopefully this collab session, I'm just going to touch on the major points and it shouldn't take too long. So thank you so much for joining me tonight as we go through this. So the first thing we've got what are the learning outcomes? What are we going to know by the time we complete this learning unit? So the learning unit on the perceiving mind, sensation and perception, basically what we'll be able to know at the end of this is we'll be able to understand the different concepts and issues in psychophysics, which is around sensation, perception, words such as transduction, threshold, signal detection theory, perception without awareness, and sensory adaptation. We'll understand those terms as we move through them in the rest of this collab. We'll be able to identify the different structures in the human eye, because obviously the eye is one of the main organs for sensation, and be able to look at the visual pathway, how the neural signals move through to the brain. We'll do a similar thing for the ear and discuss the sound as a stimulus and the different hearing capacities and how we process the information, and also look at our gustatory, which is our taste, and our olfactory, which is our smell system. So those are the learning outcomes for this learning unit. Again, it's a little bit biology based, but it's not terribly complex and it's relatively easy material to work through. So sensation and perception are very important, and they are some of the oldest and most important topics in all of psychology. And as people, as humans, we are equipped with senses. We all know our senses. It's seeing or sight, hearing and taste. And it's all the things that help us make sense of the way around us. And the way we interpret this information is called our perception. So we have our sensation, which is the light, and how we actually interpret light, how it goes to our brains, and how we make sense of that sensation of light as visual images will help us gain our experiences of the world. Everything we gather from around us is brought into our body through our senses. And those are our connections to the world outside. And it's those senses that send messages to our brain, and it's our brain that interprets the messages and actually creates the perception of what is around us. So it's 2 processes. It's how we sense something and how we make sense of that as a perception to interpret the world around us. But obviously, we don't operate in a vacuum, and our experiences, our beliefs, our culture, and everything around us, our environment, helps us make sense of what we're noticing. So all the time we are receiving thousands and thousands and thousands of stimuli into our senses, and our brain is making sense of them all. And it gathers that information through our senses, and it interprets it and perceives the world around us, which creates our life experiences. So it's quite amazing when we think all of the time, all day and all night, we're getting incoming information, almost information overload, and our brain is making sense of all that information to make sense of the world and how we think and how our moods are and how we feel and that kind of thing. So that's why in psychology, it's important to understand the sense that comes in and how our brain makes sense of that information. And at any point, if there's a breakdown between the two processes, so in our sensory system of sensation and perception, any breakdown in that can cause an impairment. And one of the examples they give in the textbook is the impairment of agnosia, which is a disorder where somebody can't recognize or identify objects or persons or sounds using their senses, despite the fact that their senses are actually functioning. So it's a breakdown in how the stimulus that comes into our body, it's sensed, but our brain is not making sense of that stimulus, and it can result in an impairment. So the example they give in the book is it's a book by an author, and it's called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And you can actually go onto Google and you can download, just Google PDF of that particular book. And it's a really interesting book made up of case studies from a psychologist called Oliver Sacks. And the very first case study in the book is about agnosia. And it's about a very clever musician who was amazingly gifted, but he couldn't make sense of the things around him. And at one point he tries to pick up his wife's head and put it on his his own head as a hat, which is why it's called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. So although he was getting the incoming information, he actually wasn't sure what to do with it. There was a breakdown in perception. So that whole process of the sensory system is very important. So the concept of psychophysics, it's psychology and physics, and it's how that stimulus in the environment, whether it's light or sound or smell or taste, it's how that stimulus is converted into perceptions and the psychological experience that we have from those perceptions. So it's psychophysics, and the physics part is around the stimulus, and the psycho part is around the psychology, and it's the interpretation of those that actually impact how we experience things. So our entire sensory system, and it is a system, and it's made up of two processes. It's made up of a process of sensation and perception. So the sensation part of it is the process by which our sensory systems and our nervous system receive that information from the environment and take it and translate it into neural impulses that then are perceived. So the sensation is the incoming information, how it's received into our body, and the perception part is the organizing and the interpreting of that sensory information to enable meaningful recognition of objects and events. So sensation is the input and the perception is how we make use of that information. So together those things make up the sensory system. So within our sensory system, the first part of it is the stimulus, and that's in our environment. So our environment consists of thousands of stimuli. So think about light and what is the stimulus. So the stimulus is light. It enters our eye, it travels to our brain, and our brain makes sense of that information. A stimuli could be a touch on the skin. It could be a taste in the mouth or a smell in the nose. So the stimuli are the things in their environment that actually help us to sense what is happening around us. And once that stimulus engages with us, there's a process called transduction where that stimulus is actually converted into raw energy into those neural signals. So we spoke in our chapter around the biology of psychology, or the biology of the body and the brain, about neural transmission. So every stimulus that comes into our body will be converted into those neural signals that travel through our body to our brain. So that sensory information moves from its input point in our body to our brain. And obviously there are thousands of stimuli happening all the time, all around us, and we can't pay attention to all of them all of the time. So we have selective attention, which is we choose which signals we want to pay attention to. Okay, so there's a lot of things happening to us in the background that we're unaware of, but if we change how if we focus on listening to something or a sense of touch, then we're paying selective attention to that particular stimulus. And the process of sensory adaptation means if there's a stimulus that is just humming along in the background and it's not changing, like for example, you're sitting in a room and the air conditioner is on and that air conditioner is humming all day, you pay less attention to it. It's sort of a non-changing source of stimulation. So as the stimulus comes into our body, we choose what we really want to give our brain focus to. And sometimes those stimuli, if they don't change, it's almost we pay less attention to them. It's a sensory adaptatory process. It prevents us overloading our brains with things that we don't actually need to pay attention to. But as people, the sense of or perception is very subjective, and we all perceive things differently. Nobody ever necessarily perceives things in the same way as somebody else. And it really is very much dependent upon our own individual sensory systems. It's dependent on our own individual environments and our context and our experiences, our lived experiences, as to how we perceive things. So you might perceive a smell one way. It could evoke a childhood memory of something cooking in the kitchen, whereas to somebody else, if they have that smell, maybe it's a smell of something that made them ill, and so their perception of that smell is very different to your perception of the smell. So our individual experiences really guide our process of perception. So when all this information comes into our brain and we need to start to make sense of it, there's two ways of processing information. That is, we have bottom-up processing where there's little building blocks come in and we put all those blocks together into a more complex thing to make sense of. Or there's top-down processing where our memory and cognitive processes of things we already know in our mind make sense of that information. So two ways of processing information is bottom up, all the little pieces come together into a more complex process, or making sense of something by what we already know. It's a top-down approach of processing. So the process of the sensory system is the stimulation comes into our being, or through touch or sound or light. A process of transduction happens where that stimulus is converted into energy and we perceive it. And we sense it, and then it travels to the brain where we perceive it. So light waves come into the eye, they create neural signals, and neural signals travel to the brain, and the brain is the part of our body that is responsible for perception. So in our environment, we've got thousands and thousands of stimuli. So how do we notice things in our environment, things that are happening all around us? So there's a concept called a threshold. And in order for us to notice something, it has to reach a point where whatever we're noticing is triggering a response. So that is called your threshold. So if you push your finger on your nail into your finger, it's a point at which that stimulus starts to feel pain would be the threshold. It's triggering a response of pain. So it's a certain point at which the stimulus can trigger a response. And the intensity of the stimulus is how strong that stimulus has to be in order to be detected. So an absolute threshold is the smallest amount of a stimulus that can be detected for a specified period of time. So for example, your hearing. You can hear something close by, you can hear something a little bit further away, but your absolute threshold is the point at which you can actually hear something. So vision could be a candle flame 30 miles away is the point where you would start to see that flame. A watch ticking 20 feet away is the point at which you would hear that watch. A drop of perfume in a 6-roomed house is the point at which you would smell that perfume. If you have a gallon of water or liters of water and you put a drop of sugar in and you can't taste it and you can't taste it, at what point can you taste that the water is sweeter? That's the threshold. Touch is a wing of a fly on your cheek dropped at 1 centimeter. So those are the absolute thresholds. It's the smallest amount of that stimulus that you can detect for a specified period of time. So it's not just a once-off quick thing. It's something that you can smell for a period of time. Okay, do you all understand the concept of absolute threshold? Otherwise, we would be completely overloaded by things. And the difference threshold is the smallest detectable differences between two stimuli. So, for example, if you look at the picture on the right, it's the smallest amount of change that you can detect. So it's what point does one shade of blue become another shade of blue? Where is that change in recognition, the change in color? It's the just noticeable difference between two things that happen. So your threshold is, absolute threshold is, I can see a candle 30 miles away, but not 31 miles away. So there's a difference there, a just noticeable difference of where that stimulus is able to trigger a perception. And your just noticeable difference is the difference between two different stimuli, where you can see something and where you can't. So the theory of signal detection, detecting all of these stimuli, signal detection, acknowledges the absolute threshold, okay? But the emphasis is very much on the psychological state that influences the detection of a stimulus. So based on our personal experiences, based on our biases, our expectations, our degrees of motivation, there are certain things that allow us to detect signals. And again, we have what's called a signal detection paradigm. So if you look at that little box there, and you have a signal coming in to your body and you respond to it. So that's a correct response to the signal. But sometimes there's a lot of noise going on around us and we respond incorrectly. We respond to the noise instead of to the actual signal. So sometimes there's false alarms. Sometimes we don't hear the signal. Okay, so we reject the correct signal. And sometimes we reject the noise and we realize that's actually not what we're listening for, it's something else. So it's almost like a little paradigm of being able to respond to the right things in the environment, but to also recognize that within our environment, our personal space, our sensitivity level, our alertness, we may respond to the wrong thing. Okay, so that's what a signal detection paradigm is that we don't always respond to the signal. Sometimes we respond to the noise that's going on around us, a bit like a false alarm. An alarm going off in a house and you think that there's a burglary taking place and you rush outside and you respond to the alarm, but then at the same time a window breaks and it's actually a false alarm, it's not a burglary. So it depends. Our sense of awareness around our own personal safety might have been heightened at that point. We heard the alarm, we think there's some robbers or something in the neighborhood, and because that is heightened, we respond incorrectly to a different stimulus. So that's what the paradigm really means. Sorry, that sounds a bit complicated, but it's not actually that complicated. And if you read it, you'll be able to understand what I'm talking about. And perception without awareness. So again, it's like there's so much going on in our environment that often we have sensations that don't cause a reaction, which is possibly because there's other things going on around us that we take for granted. We have subconscious perceptions that can influence a person's experiences. So if you go into a shop and there's music playing in the background and we're not listening to the music, it's there, it's in the background, it's coming into us, but we're not actually paying attention to it. One of the studies showed that if you're in a wine shop and there is German music playing, there was an increase in the sales of German wine. If there's French music playing, there's an increase in the sales of French wine. So we're all almost like perceiving that information. The information's coming into our brain, but we're actually not aware of it. It's almost like a subliminal perception or a subconscious perception that the stimuli are coming in, but we're not noticing them as stimuli, but yet our brain is responding to them. We're perceiving them, but we're actually not aware of them happening. And our sensory adaptation, we spoke to that, it's that basically is we become less sensitive to a stimulus because we have extended exposure to it. So it's almost like you get used to a pain level. So people who live with a level of pain, maybe from a bone injury or something, their body almost like adapts to it. It adapts to that level of pain. So it's continuous, it's ongoing. So our sensitivity to it weakens. It's the same, like I said, with the air conditioner. If you're in a room and there's an air conditioner buzzing, you gradually get used to it. So it's sensory adaptation to that incoming stimulus. So those are all the terms related to sensation and perception. And our senses are broken down obviously into visual, into auditory, into smell, into taste, and into touch. And for each of our senses, there are different ways that our body experiences those sensations. So the stimulus comes into our body in different ways, in different forms, and our brain processes that sensory information in different ways, depending on where that sensory information ends up in our brain, but also dependent upon what we know about that sensation or that stimulus based on our experiences. So we'll move through the different senses, and in each sense we look at what the stimulus is in the environment. We'll look at the anatomy in our body that receives that stimulus, and then we'll look at how that stimulus travels to the brain and how the brain makes sense of it. So let's start with the eye and let's start with vision. It's probably the biggest section here because it's probably one of the most important of our senses is our sight. So within our environment, what is it in our environment that creates the stimulus of sight? And it's light. Okay, light refracts off everything in our environment around us. That's what enables us to see. So it's visible light or energy, which is moving in electromagnetic radiation waves. So light is bouncing off everything and it's coming into our body through our eyes. So with our stimulus, and it's the same with auditory, it's basically moving in waves. So the example I've got on the right hand side is the picture of a wave. It's a light wave. So light moves through the electromagnetic spectrum in radiation waves, and the waves have different heights. The height is what goes up, and it's known as the amplitude. That is the height of the wave. And it's also measured between the distance in the waves, which is your wave length. So different electromagnetic waves will have different heights and different wavelengths, depending on what they are refracting from. So the waves, the height of the wave, so how high the wave is, the amplitude of the wave influences the brightness of what we're seeing. Okay, everyone is aware of a bright image or a dim image. So the higher the wave, the higher the amplitude, the brighter what we see is from the electromagnetic spectrum. And the wavelength, which is the difference between those peaks, that gives us our perception of color and shade. So within our environment, there's light bouncing off everything with different wavelengths, different waves, and they're all entering our eyes, but each one has different amplitudes and different wavelengths. And the saturation is around the perception of color. So some things we can't see. Some things, those like gamma rays and things like that, we don't see them. We only see a small portion of the visible spectrum. That's where we see color. So the saturation is our perception of color within that visible spectrum. So transduction, as we discussed, is about taking the energy from that stimulus, it's the light waves, and turning those light waves into neural impulses so that our brain can start to make sense of them and start to understand what we are seeing. So the stimulus in the case of vision, in the case of eyes, is electromagnetic radiation waves with different amplitudes and wavelengths that enter our eyes in order for us to be able to see and make sense of what we are seeing. Does that make sense to everybody? So the organ in our body around vision is the eye. The eye is the sensory organ that allows those stimuli into our body to make sense of them. And the eye transports the stimuli to the brain, which creates the images that we see, that is our perception. So part of this is to understand how the light, how that visual energy, those electromagnetic waves, how do they end up in our brain? So those light waves that are coming along in our environment, they enter our eye through the cornea. Everybody knows what the cornea is at the front of our eye. It's that thing that covers our eye surface. It's like a bit like a mirror that you in front of your eye. It's sort of a liquid membrane in front of your eye. And that's why the light comes in through that, and it travels from there into the iris, which is the color part of your eye, and in the middle of your eye is the pupil. Okay, and the pupil can open and close, which then allows either more light or less light into your body. And that pupil opening and closing, think back to what we discussed about the autonomic nervous system, about fight or flight, and about how those sensations can cause our pupil to dilate or contract. So the pupil itself is part of our autonomic nervous system, and it sort of regulates automatically the amount of light that it's letting in to our eye. So that is what lets the light into our eye. And behind the pupil is a lens, and I've got a diagram there on your left-hand side. Behind the pupil is a lens that alters light waves through a process of accommodation for better visual focus. So our lens sort of adjusts our eye to what we're seeing for better visual focus. And from that, the light that comes in is refracted, so it's broken up into smaller particles and pieces, and it refracts onto the lens, from the lens onto the back of our eye, which is where the retina is. And the retina is the important part of our eye that allows us to actually start to process visual information. The retina, interestingly, forms part of our central nervous system, so it in itself does have an ability to process information, and that's where the first piece of information processing happens with vision. It's in our retina. And from the retina inside has little things called rods and cones, and those receptors of rods and cones, that's where the conversion of light into those neural impulses that we spoke about takes place. So we have more cones than rods, and the cones in our eyes are specifically for the brighter environments around visual detail and sharpness, and the rods play a role in our peripheral vision, so what we see on the side, about being light sensitive and working in dim light. So our cones adjust to that. They adjust to light and dark adaptation. So it's in the retina that transduction happens, where the stimulus is actually converted into those neural impulses, which then travel to the brain via our optic nerve. So all the way shooting along with little action potentials along those long axons that form the optic nerve, that actually then move to our brain where vision can occur. So that is the process that whereby light from the outside enters our body. It's translated from the stimulus into a neural impulse, which then starts to move to the brain. So the axons in the optic nerve, they carry that information, which are electrical impulses, to the optic chiasm. And the axon and the optic nerve, I think they cross over. So it's almost like it's the right eye reflects onto the left side of the brain, and the left eye reflects onto the right side of the brain. There's a nice image there that just shows exactly how the whole process works. From the object, light refracting off the object, in this case a mug, it passes through the lens into the back of our eye where we focus, into the optic nerve where it then travels into our brain. And there's two pathways that it can take. There's the lateral geniculate nucleus, LGN, and the superior collicus. The LGN is the main pathway for the movement of these electrical impulses. And in most of our senses, everything that enters our brain when it comes to senses ends up at that thalamus. We spoke about the thalamus, and we spoke about how the thalamus is almost the relay station. So all those electrical impulses end up at the thalamus, and then the thalamus sends them off to the area of the brain we spoke about called the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe. So that's where the perception starts to happen. So there's the entire process, and it's amazing to think that, I mean, we're seeing all of the time. Our eyes, it gives you the level of processing ability in our brain that we're making sense of so much information through our vision, and our brain is able to work with all that information and allow us to experience it. So the information processing of that is actually in the primary visual cortex, where it basically, the image is reconstructed from the different receptive fields of simplex and complex cells, and we also start to process around the what and the where, and we start to add to that visual image through our cognitions and what we know and what we think about. So that's the process of how the visual stimulus turns into the beginning of the perceptual process. So when it comes to vision, again, how we make sense of information. So our physiological perception is the vision as the input stimulus, making sense of it. But the psychological perception is the cognitive and affective associations based on memory. So although we might have a vision or not a vision, we see something in our mind, how we actually start to picture it and see it is very much, it's subjective. Okay, it's very much based on our personal experiences and our own environment. Even color, okay, color is very subjective. Not every person sees color the same way. How you see one shade of red might be very different to how I see one shade of red. But color is important because it gives more meaning to the stimulus. Imagine if we just saw the world in black and white all the time. Color adds meaning to the stimulus, and people see colors differently. And colors are not part of the stimuli, but they're part of the characteristic of the light wave. They come with the light waves. And different wavelengths of light result in different colors. So like we said, the amplitude of the height determines its brightness. So there are different color light waves that enter our body, so that the light wave itself is the stimulus. The color travels along with it, and how we interpret that color, how we make sense of it, is what our brain organizes for us. So color perception has a very big influence on us. Color perception can influence our emotions. A calming color. What is a calming color? Blue is a calming color. So the color blue can have an impact on how we feel about things. It impacts on our behavior. Imagine it's like skin color. Skin color creates perceptual differences, which can lead to racial stereotyping. So our perception of color is very important. And again, it's our brain that's making sense of these colors and applying different things to them. So how do we see color? Bearing in mind we all see color differently, and there are two theories of how we see color, but one is not correct. Basically both work together. One is called the Trichomatic Theory, which says that the color vision takes place at the retinal level, where we've got our three types of cones. So we've got cones, and we've got some cones that see red, some see green, and some see blue, and they work with the waves, and they basically color mix. They mix the wavelengths together, adding and subtracting colors, a bit like mixing colors in a color palette. So that's the Trichomatic Theory. Is color, the color sensation happens at the retinal level using the cones, the primary colors of red, green, and blue, and they work together to add or subtract, to mix colors into different hues. And the opponent process theory, and really you just need to touch on these two things and just need to understand that there's two different approaches to color, is that it takes place at the ganglion level, and each cells have different color pairs, but we can only detect one opposing color at a time. So one color suppresses the other color. And I think you've heard of color blindness before. Now it's called color deficiency. It's no longer called color blindness. It's called a color deficiency. And that's where some people have sometimes it can be genetic, a problem with the cones in interpreting different colors. I don't know, Jen. It's a very complex thing to understand objectively, to know what something really looks like. It's all very, very subjective, and it gets down to our ability to communicate with each other and how we perceive different things. So the whole concept of perception is very subjective. It is quite impossible to know objectively what something really looks like. Except you can take it down to your, we haven't done it in this module, but it's part of our thinking and how we process information through prototypes and how we develop prototypes of what things look like. And it's how we develop those prototypes that actually will gauge how we think about something. But we'll cover that in a later module. So interpreting the information from the eyes, again, that once it gets to our brain, there are still multiple factors that can impact on how we perceive things. And again, it's very subjective. The concept of reversible figures. So if you look at the picture on the far left-hand side, if you look at it from one way, and I don't know what you see, I always see the rabbit, but maybe some people see the duck. It's how our brain is interpreting the information. It's not a direct translation of what we're seeing. It's almost like our brain is processing information in different ways, which allows us to see things differently. How you might see it is different to how I see it. If you look at it could be because they see a different shade, but it could also be because of the emotions attached to that shade. So bearing in mind that different colors have different emotions and things attached to them, different memories. It could be something very subjective, like a color has a different emotional response in one person than it does to another. So it could be how they are actually perceiving the shade rather than they're not seeing it exactly the same as you. It's their way of interpreting it. It's around the perception. So if you look at the figure in the middle, if you look at the middle figure, how do you see what that is? If you move your eyes from left to right, or if you move your eyes from right to left, what you see from left to right, start with left, it's a man's face. When you get to the middle, you're still seeing the man's face. Now move your eyes from right to left. Do you see a woman hunched over her knee? So again, that is not the sensation of seeing, it's the perception. And whether you're looking at an image from left to right or right to left, it can change. It's very subjective. It's not a direct translation of what is coming into our body. A perceptual set is basically, it's the way that we're set up to receive a stimulus. It's based on our previous experiences. And if you think of getting a bunch of flowers, or I say to you, can I give you a bunch of flowers? What do you automatically think of when I say to you, I'm giving you a bunch of flowers? Do you think of maybe a whole bunch of red roses because red is your favorite color? Do you think of the last bunch of flowers you received that look like that? Therefore, your next bunch of flowers might look the same way. Do you think of flowers, well, lily makes me think of funerals, it makes me sad, so I don't want it. It's our perceptual set. It's about how ready we are to receive information in a particular way based on our past experiences. And past experiences are something, influence our Proteus for me, okay, influences our current ones. So we already have a perceptual set in our brain made up from our cognitions and our experiences that impact on how we interpret those stimuli. How we put things together, and how we're organizing what comes into our vision is really important. Again, we spoke bottom up or top down processing. Inattentional blindness. We fail to see fully visible objects or events in our visual display because our attention is focused elsewhere. So you could be watching a rugby match and the referee blows his whistle somewhere for a foul, and your friend says, "Did you see that?" And you say, "No, because you were watching something that was happening on the other end of the field." So it's about our inattentional blindness. We can't pay attention to everything all of the time in our range of vision, so our attention can be focused elsewhere. So we're maybe not giving 100% attention to what we should be looking at, we're looking at something else. The principles of Gestalt, which is basically, it's a type of psychology that says you need to look at the whole picture. And the whole picture means that the sum of the whole, that does explain a lot of rugby scores, the sum of the whole is greater than its parts. And it also says we're born with tendencies to start to recognize incoming information. So that little picture there at the bottom is a typical Gestalt image, where do you see two faces or do you see a drinking glass? So the Gestalt psychology says basically, do we look at the figure first and the background later, or do we look at the background first and the figure later? So what are you looking at first? Are you looking at the foreground or your background? And so dividing up the figure and the ground influences how we perceive something. Often close, the proximity of things. If we're looking at like a scattering of heavens, tennis balls on a tennis court, we tend to group things that are close together. Proximity, so things that are closer together, we see them better because they're closer together. We also group things that are similar. If you've got a range of things in your eyes, you tend to group together what is similar. Yeah, you didn't see the faces till I mentioned it. You saw the wine glass, didn't you? And yeah, simplicity. We organize things in the simplest way possible, and our brain often does that. It works around what is the easiest way to see this. The simplest way is the best way. And we basically form perceptual hypothesis, which is an inference about what form could be responsible for the pattern of sensory stimulation. The context in which we see something often guides the perceptual hypothesis. So you know those things where you read where there's a word and they put a couple of the letters back to front. But because we're reading that word in a sentence, we actually don't even interpret that some of the letters are back to front, because we're reading it in the context of a paragraph. We understand the meaning of the paragraph, and because that happens, we actually don't even see that the letters in the word are back to front. So it's saying the context in which something appears is already shaping how we're going to think about what we're seeing, if you understand that. So all of those things tell us the important role that the brain has in our perception. Part of our perception as well is we've looked at color, we've looked at shape and form. It's also, again, distance. So our brain tells us how near or how far something is away from us. And there are cues in our vision that help us judge that. So when we look at things from both eyes, the closer the object is, the eyes turn inwards and able to see it and to focus on it. How far away objects are, they don't have as much clarity. Images will project differently on the left and right retinas. Singular clues or monocular clues is if you close one eye, you have an issue of depth perception. Some people, if they have a patch over their eye, automatically struggle to perceive the depth in something. So it's our brain saying to us, are we seeing this through one eye or two eyes? If there's something placed between you and another object and they're exactly the same size, the object that's closer to you appears larger, although both of those squares are the same size. So again, perceiving depth is part of our perceptual process. Perceptual constancies in vision allows for stable perception in the face of changing sensory input. So it's being able to see things despite all of the other senses changing. So that door is the same size, but the door on the right looks, the way it's set across, looks like it's like slightly bigger. The power of misleading cues, visual illusions. We're all very familiar with visual illusions. And the elephant, how many legs does the elephant have there? That's one of my favorites. It's got 4, but you tend to see 6 legs. And it's a discrepancy between the appearance, what we're seeing, and how our brain is perceiving it. It's a misleading cue and it's a visual illusion. And that's what our brain is doing. It's trying to make sense of what we're seeing, but there are disparities and it's creating a visual illusion. So now the last few get shorter. The eye is the big one. It's the longer one because it's probably slightly more complex. But move to the ear and move to sound. So like we had light waves, what do we hear? We hear sound waves. And what are sound waves? Sound waves are molecules in the atmosphere around us that are colliding together. Something sets off a sound wave and it forms a wave. And it's the same like when we looked back at the light wave. It's got an amplitude, which is the height, and the higher that amplitude, the louder the sound. It's measured in decibels, and the distance between the wavelength, it's the pitch. Okay, everyone knows what pitch is, a high pitch or a low pitch. Okay, and the timbre is the purity or the quality of the sound. So when we're looking at sound, we look at the volume of the sound, we look at the pitch of the sound, and we look at the timbre of the sound. So it's sound waves that are set off by molecules colliding with each other. And like our ears, it's like our eyes, it's our ears that channel that energy. So our ears are responsible for receiving that auditory stimulus of sound waves, which enter our ear. That outer part of our ear, the pinna, sits there to collect sound. And it comes into our pinna, the certain frequencies. You know that when there's some sounds you can't hear. Okay, so it's again, if somebody has that, like it could be almost like a test where they set off a sound vibration, and at what point you can actually hear it. So there's certain sounds we can hear. We can only hear sounds within a certain range. That's what we perceive, and that's what we make sense of. And that's what's received by our ear. And our ear has three sections to it. It's got the external ear, which is our pinna, our outside ear. That's what collects those sound waves. And they go into our eardrum. And then the sound wave moves into our middle ear. So sometimes you get a middle ear infection. It's not too far back in our brain. Which has got those little mechanical pieces in it, three tiny little bones called the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, which are called the ossicles, and that's what starts to vibrate. So when the sound wave enters our ear, all of those little three things start to vibrate, and from the middle ear, it travels into our inner ear. And the inner ear is made up of the cochlea, which is like a little fluid-filled tunnel, and it's made up of lots and lots and lots of little hair cells, and those are actually our auditory receptors. That's where the translation of information from that sound wave, from the vibration, starts to happen. It's inside the inner ear, in the cochlea, in all of those little hair cells, and the hair cells are all lined up along the basilar membrane, and I'll show you a picture on the next slide. So what those hair cells do, all of those little hairs, they convert those vibrations that are coming in from the sound waves. That's where it starts to form that impulse, that nerve impulse, that electrical impulse that then travels, like the eye had the optic nerve. This travels through our auditory canal to our auditory cortex, and again it goes via the thalamus, which we said is our little switch box relay station that says where these electrical impulses go. So studies demonstrate that the auditory cortex has specialized cells that have developed special sensitivity to certain features of sound. So that's the process by which we receive the stimulus of sound waves that then start to be converted and travel to our brains. So there you can see on the right-hand side, that's the little cochlea that's unbound with the basal membrane and all of those little hairs, okay, that vibrate. So the theories of hearing, how do we perceive sound? So when it reaches our brain, how do we make sense of it? How we make sense of it is a psychological process. And it takes into account the pitch of the sound we're hearing, the loudness, and the quality of the sound. So that's what our brain does. It says we've got all these little vibrations converted to electrical impulses. They reach our brain. Now what do we do? What are we hearing? So the place theory is one of those theories that tells us how we think about sound, about different places on that membrane. Different groups of hair cells have different pitches. that account for most of the sounds we hear, but not the very low sounds. And the frequency theory says that the whole basilar membrane vibrates, which causes the auditory nerve to fire at different rates for different frequencies. Therefore, the brain detects the frequency of a tone by the rate at which the auditory nerve fires. And so auditory localization says, well, where is the sound? Where is the sound in space? Where is it around us? Is it behind us? Is it in front of us? So like our eyes, our two ears are set apart, and they contribute to auditory localization. So our perception says, how loud is the sound? Something louder to you that you're going to automatically perceive as closer to you. And it also listens to the timing of the sound. It listens to the cues from each ear to localize that sound in space. Some people have a more dominant ear, where one ear receives a sound faster than the other. So our brain is actually saying to us, I'm trying to find out where that sound is around us. Is it to my left? Is it to my right? Is it behind me or in front of me? So it does that by localizing where the sound has come from. That's our perception of sound, and it bases it on the sound, on the pitch, and on the timbre. And now we have our sense of smell and taste. Those are chemical senses, the smell and taste. And those arise with the sense of we do taste first. So basically the sense of smell and taste, sense of smell arises from molecules in the air. Okay, it's a chemical sense. And the sense of taste arises from molecules dissolved in saliva. So although the sense of smell and taste are separate, they do influence each other. We know that smell and taste are very closely linked. They're both chemical senses, and they're both based upon molecules either from the air or actually dissolved in saliva for taste, because we taste through our tongues, but they're separate sensory systems. So if we look at taste, which is gustation. That's the name gustation we saw in our learning outcomes. It says understand what gustation is. Gustation is taste, and it has its physical stimulus and chemical substances dissolved in water, and the water is the saliva in our mouths. And the receptors, what actually receives the taste, that sense of taste into our mouths, it's those taste buds, those little cells around our taste buds, tiny little bumps on the tongue, which absorb the chemicals, and they trigger neural impulses and send the information to the thalamus, again the relay station, and onto the cortex, where we make sense of the taste. So we've got 5 primary tastes. There used to be 4, but more recently another one's been added. So we've got sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and I don't know if you've heard of umami. Umami is more of that savory flavor. So it's a new taste profile that's been added to our taste collection. So we taste sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and umami, and they're not distributed equally on the tongue, as they've got an even distribution. And our taste is actually a blend of these 4, complex blend, and we learn our taste preferences. They're adapted over time, based again on our experiences, our genetic factors, our social cultural factors. You might associate a taste, say you really love pizza, and you put it in your mouth, you love the taste of pizza. But at one point you ate a pizza that made you sick. It maybe gave you food poisoning. So how you experience that taste, it can change based upon your experience. One point you really love the taste of pizza, and another time you taste pizza and you go, oh, this tastes horrible, because you've associated a different experience to that pizza. So again, some people like sweet things, some people like sour things. Some people like savory things. It's complex, and it's based on our experiences, our genetic factors. So there is very much an individual influence around taste. And perception of flavor, how do we actually perceive the flavor? Flavor is a combination. Our perception of flavor is a combination of taste, smell, and the tactile sensation of food in the mouth. So those 3 things work together when we're eating. It's often a case of we can smell it, we can taste it, and this is what it feels like. And those things combined give us that perception of flavor. And the smell obviously makes the biggest contribution to the perception of flavor. So the 2 things around smell and taste do interact with our perception of how we experience flavor. And smell. Okay, so again, the smell, what we smell comes from molecules in the air, which actually enter our nose. Those molecules travel into our nose, and it operates much like the sense of taste, the physical stimuli. So what is causing that sense of smell? What is the stimuli? It's chemical substances carried in the air that is dissolved in fluid, which is the mucus in the nose. So those molecules enter our nose, and they get dissolved in mucus, and they move on to olfactory receptors. So those are the little things that they bind under in order to start the transmission process to the brain. So little hairs in our nose, olfactory cilia, are in the upper part of the nasal passage, and different combinations of receptors are responsible for different smells. So we've got thousands and thousands of those little hair receptors. They're all different sizes. Molecules are different sizes. The different size molecules bind onto different size receptors, and those combinations of receptors is what are responsible for our differences in smell. So one molecule is not one smell. It's a combination of molecules on a combination of receptors that give us a specific smell. And from there, the smell travels to the olfactory bulb, where it moves into our it starts to move to our brain. Now, the interesting thing is, out of all of our senses, it's the sense of smell that doesn't move to the thalamus. It's the only one. Okay, so that bypasses the thalamus, and it moves straight to the temporal lobe. That's where the sense of smell goes. It goes to the temporal lobe, which sits next to our limbic system. And the limbic system, like, it's got the amygdala in it. It holds memories. That's what that system does, which often can maybe account for why smell is so triggering for memories. I think one of the memories that we all have is thinking back to a kitchen and our family kitchen, our family home. A lot of it's based around smell. A lot of our memories are smell based, and that's maybe because that the temporal lobe sits very close to the system in our brain that is responsible for memory formation. So humans can distinguish, it's amazing, about 10,000 odors, but for some reason quite often find it difficult to attach names to odors. So you can just imagine how many molecules are coming through the air. Some things smell more than others, bigger molecules, more molecules. The closer you are to something, it smells more compared to how far away you is. So that sense of smell is linked to so many different things, but again, all the time there are those molecules moving through the air and moving to our brain. And one of the outcomes, it's not in your outcome, but it's the final sense, is our sense of touch. So that's our skin. Our skin is our biggest sensory organ. It covers our entire body, and it delivers more direct contact with our immediate environment because of anything else. It's often the first part of our body to come into contact with anything. So that sense of touch, that physical, so to get impact, to get the stimulus on our skin, it's a sense of touch. It's also thermal. It's about heat change. We can sense heat change, and we can sense chemical energy impinging on our skin. So that is the stimuli in our environment responsible for feeling sensation in our skin: mechanical, thermal, and chemical energy. So there's different types of sensory receptors in our skin, or sensory receptors in our body, which are routed throughout the spinal column to the brain stem, to the thalamus, because everything goes to the thalamus, being the relay station, and from there it goes to the somatosensory cortex, which is about locating our body in space. It's about balance. It's about the sense of touch. And nerve fibers in our skin, so our skin is made up of nerve fibers. That's what we feel when we touch, and some parts of the body are more sensitive than others. So if you prick your skin on your toe compared to if you prick your skin on, I don't know, somewhere else that's really sensitive, but you understand how different parts of the body have different nerves. Some areas are more sensitive than others. And the skin can also help tell us where that stimulus is happening. If we stand on a drawing pin, it can automatically tell us where we've stood on that drawing pin in our foot, and it can detect the size and the shape. So you know automatically from that sense of the drawing pin entering your foot, you go, oh no, I stood on a drawing pin. You know it's a pin, you know it's sharp, you know the shape of it, and also the location of it. So the skin helps us do that. The temperature, we can feel temperature around us. There's free nerve endings in the skin that are specific for cold and warmth. And one of the important things about skin is it's about pain. It's about pain receptors. Pain receptors are generally free nerve endings in our skin, which transmit information to the brain. So when we feel pain, there's a fast pathway to the brain. So those are going to be through those myelinated axons where the electrical impulses travel quickly to the brain in a fraction of a second. That's where we can automatically react to that pain sensation from our skin, from those free nerve endings where that pin broke the flesh of our foot. That is a really fast neural pathway to our brain that says, take your foot away from the pain. But then there's also slow pathways. That's where you have the more aching or the less localized, longer lasting pain. So where you bump your elbow on something, that's not a sharp pain. It's almost like it's a slower pain. It's an ache. It lasts longer. That moves through a different pathway to our brain. And again, pain can be very subjective. People have different pain thresholds. And the final part of pain is a gate theory. So it almost says that the signals for pain can be altered when they reach the spinal cord. There is a theory called the gate theory. So if you shut your finger in a door and you release it from where you've trapped it and you put your finger around it really tight, it's almost like you're refocusing your attention on that new sensation, blocking the pain like a gate. So we can actually reduce pain. We can reduce, or we can create endorphins which suppress the feeling of pain and refocuses our attention, and therefore the pain is not as severe. So if you stand on the drawing pen and you rub your foot where you go, oh no, pull it out and rub your foot. Rubbing your foot changes the attention from that sharp pain. It refocuses the attention, and it's almost like it's called a gate theory, where we can alter the feeling of pain. So guys, that is sensation and perception. It's not that hard. It's quite a lot of information, but it's quite straightforward. It's interesting. It really is. When we just look at the environment and all of those stimuli, I think every time we do this, I always think of the world in a different way. I think of everything around me in different ways. But that's sensation and perception. I hope it made sense. I have recorded this. I will upload it. If you've got any questions, please feel free to ask. I didn't see any questions, only a couple. Have a look at some optical illusions tonight. Yeah, guys, any questions, or are you all good? No, you don't need to submit the rubric as part of your PDF submission. No, it's just part of your question paper. So don't worry about that. Any other questions on the assignment? Awesome. Okay, I'm just going to stop the recording.